we can't just expect people overnight to be really involved in this process that we spent some time on, right? And so there is some culture shift that had to happen so that we were handling the enough vulnerabilities, right? We did focus on our criticals and our highs, and that we're reducing some of the noise that was generated, and that we're working with engineers and understanding their concerns and figuring out where in the roadmap we can fit a bulk of these vulnerabilities that makes sense for that business at that time.
Welcome to The Elephant in AppSec, the podcast to explore, challenge, and boldly face the AppSec elephants in the room. I'm Alexandra, your host and AppSec enthusiast and growth manager at Escape, an API discovery and security platform. Today, I'm super excited to have Ariel Shin on the podcast. Ariel started as a pentester, moved into AppSec, and now she's security engineer manager at Datadog. Before that, she led the product security team at Twilio, where she led an effort to democratize vulnerability management across the company, which had a significant impact on reducing risk. She's also a regular speaker at conferences, and I actually got to meet her in person for the first time at BSides San Francisco this year, where she led an impressive panel on scale and security. Quick special announcement for the Elephant and AppSec. In November, we're hosting the first Elephant and AppSec virtual conference. Join us and hear from speakers who aren't afraid to share their strong opinions. But now, back to this episode. In this episode, I learned from Ariel why cultural transformation is challenging but necessary for successful product security initiatives, and how democratizing vulnerability management involves shifting responsibility of risk from security compliance to engineering, and much more. If you're interested in practical ways to ease the cognitive load on engineers, find allies in security, and start creating a real shift in culture, this episode is for you. Dive right in.
Hi, Ariel. So I'm very excited to have you on the podcast today. So thanks a lot for joining. And yeah, it was exciting to actually meet you in real life, a couple of months ago, and actually introduce your panel. And I know you've done also another presentation, at BSides as well. So it kind of was very popular at the event, but it was great to have a chat with you. Also, we were surrounded by other podcast guests, and now kind of been sharing with everyone. I've been quite active within the last month as well, like sharing your experience and sharing your background with everyone, and just providing actually like insights with the presentations, with podcasts and everything. And I've kind of been reading more about your experience online as well. You've been, I think, at Twilio with Jivan. And I think one of the experience at Twilio, you mentioned in your bio that I've led the charge in democratizing, vulnerability management. So kind of it was an initiative that led to significant risk reduction, which is like kind of one of the key points, in security. Like risk is something that you hear like literally in every single content, that's related to cybersecurity and or the article, and it was done with a huge success. I think that's something that's also like you presented at your presentation, and I think actually like at the podcast we'll have kind of controversial questions as well. So was there like any drawbacks, to democratizing this vulnerability management? Did it actually cause, some teams to become more lax or not? So I'm very excited. I'm very curious to hear that feedback on your experience.
Definitely. So just a quick summary of what democratized vulnerability management is. It really is just a vulnerability management program in which we centralize the vulnerabilities. And we shifted the risk of a vulnerability from security and compliance to engineering. And when you make that shift, at times, if the company is not ready for it or if the company isn't bought in, you can get a lot of pushback. And so what we've really focused on was that engineers now own risk, and that's present through the features. We call engineers risk owners. They're no longer an assignee of a vulnerability ticket. They're the risk owner, and that shows to them that, hey, you now own the risk of this ticket. We also have self-service due date extensions, which means you now can extend the due date of a ticket because you own that risk. Depending on the severity of the ticket, you need to get buy-in from your engineering leads, whether that's your VP or your director, but you own that risk. You make that decision. We report out our vulnerability metrics. And so we make this very visible to folks. And so when you first start to be a lot more visible, there are some folks who will just ignore you, right? They have a million things fighting for their attention. It's super easy to just ignore that one email, ignore that one Slack message. And so we definitely did experience some of that, where folks were getting notifications and they probably created an email filter to never see an email from us again.
Oh, yeah.
And so in that way,
notifications like this.
exactly, right? And it's super easy to kind of make sure that you don't hear the noise, that like filter out all of that noise. And so we did get a lot of that. And so one of the things that we invested in that was quite expensive is we went on a road show. We went to 32 different business units and had a 10-minute presentation, 20 minutes for Q&A, where we really engaged with folks to tell them why we were doing this, how this shifted from our current status quo, and what they could benefit from this. And so that was really helpful in getting a lot of buy-in. But that was a really broad type presentation. And we still had folks who weren't fixing their vulnerabilities in time. It was still breaching, and they would get a lot of emails. And part of that was we had just a lot of vulnerabilities. Our previous system was decentralized, where we had multiple systems for tracking vulnerabilities. And so when you make it easier to kind of include all vulnerabilities in one place and make that really noisy, you tend to be a bit of a bad security partner, because you're telling engineers like, hey, you should work on this, and it's going to take you an entire quarter to fix this. So like, fix it all in time. We don't care if you, we don't want to be that. Yeah. So we can definitely be a little bit antagonistic in that way when you just roll out this program that's really noisy and doesn't adapt to the needs of the business or the needs of engineers. And so we did work on finding a balance, where we can't just expect people overnight to be really involved in this process that we spent some time on, right? And so there is some culture shift that had to happen so that we were handling enough vulnerabilities, right? We did focus on our criticals and our highs, and that we're reducing some of the noise that was generated, and that we're working with engineers and understanding their concerns and figuring out where in the roadmap we can fit a bulk of these vulnerabilities that makes sense for that business at that.
Okay. And how long, for example, you mentioned you went on a road shows, the 32 different business units. So how long did it take?
So that was over a couple of months. I missed one meeting because I overslept, because it was at 7 a.m. and I never wake up at 7 a.m. So that one was like pretty terrifying. And thankfully, one of the PMs, Alex, was on that call with me. And so he was able to give the presentation, but I've never been more mortified than that. Like that is, I have nightmares thinking about the fact that I have missed a meeting. And so it was difficult because we had teams all across the US and globally. And so that meant we had teams in Bangalore. That meant we had teams in Europe. And so the timing of those roadshows was definitely quite tough. And so with that, it did take a couple of months, but this program in total, it took about 3 years. And then before that, this program had already been started at another company called Segment, which I was originally part of, and then Twilio acquired. So another 3 years. So this program has been in its existence for over 6 years.
Okay, wow, that's really a lot of time. And you mentioned like as well that from the beginning I've assigned developer engineers to be risk owners, right? And not all risk is equal. So how did you make sure that it's kind of, some engineers don't get offended, or why am I getting, something much more risk critical, and others, that's okay, no problem. That's kind of more informational risk.
Definitely. So there are two features that we have. One is our severity rating and our severity classification. So severity rating, just like any other company, P1's a critical, a P2. We have a rating so that we can say, hey, this risk is more important. The second piece that's really important is the classification. Why is this a critical and not a high? Why is this a critical and not a low in some cases? And when you have really engaged leaders and engineers, they'll start to say, hey, I think this should be a lower severity. And they'll work with you to figure out the middle ground, because they have a lot more context as to how this could really impact their systems, versus we're looking at it from the tooling perspective or the bug bounty report, where they're doing this without a lot of that context as to how much damage can this make, or how probable is it. And so that severity classification is really important. And then engaging with our leaders to say, hey, is this actually a true P1? So
Yeah, I
that
think,
goes
yeah.
a long way in making sure that people don't feel, hey, this is a fake P1. And we would also capture metrics around how often we would change the severity, like how often were teams going in and changing a ticket from a P1 to a P3.
Okay. And what did it happen often that they changed?
In the beginning, people really ignored them. So it wasn't
Okay.
happening that often. But yes,
Yeah.
you would see people change them. It didn't happen as often as it did at segment. We saw a
Mm.
lot more negotiation because we had a lot more engaged leaders with a smaller group and more security
Okay.
representatives and a stronger security culture. We had folks who just had the knowledge and who also had the confidence to push back on security. And that made it a really healthy relationship because you had engaged engineers with an engaged security team working together to find the optimal path forward.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you. It's the culture that's super important. That actually it's more about the people who are ready to listen to your initiatives and actually get on board with what you're proposing, which is not always the case. And how, for example, for in the beginning, let's say you've assigned to someone junior who might not know how to like pick something. Did you do any specific training with them as well on how to prioritize, how to understand the risk on itself, how to kind of help them provide you feedback, or if there was more responsibility of their leadership?
So we did have some kind of like newer comers maybe have a couple of questions on things, but generally we try to make these tickets as self-service as possible. And so we include instructions on how to use these vulnerability tickets. So we'll say, what are all these different fields to transition it? What is a self-service due date extension? That was a really confusing concept for some folks because a due date's a due date. If it's due in 14 days, it's due in 14 days. If I can't work on it, I just will breach that SLA. And so we had this concept where you could extend the due date. You just need to get approval depending on the severity of the ticket. And the other piece is that we have kind of reproduction steps so that an engineer would go through and they could reproduce the vulnerability, and we'll have a criteria for remediation. What's the minimum bar to get this to be remediated? And then our kind of suggestions for how they remediate it. So all of that information is self-contained in the ticket. They can reach out to us if they have additional questions. Hey, this is kind of really complex to fix, or this is going to take longer effort. They can reach out to us through either security channels. We also had a concept of a BSO or a mini CISO for each business unit. They can reach out to them for support as well. So most often we want folks to self-service it, to be able to kind of work through these problems themselves. But if they couldn't for some of these circumstances, they'd have different avenues to reach out to us.
How did you appoint this mini CISOs for each business unit?
So I actually don't know the origin of this, but it was an official program. So it's a full-time role where we had folks who their job was to be a business unit leader. And that's because Twilio was quite large. We couldn't have a CISO represent all of the different business units' needs. They differed in security culture, in size, in org structure, in so many different ways. Their roadmaps looked really different. They were really different products. For instance, a business unit could be the size of like 2 acquisitions, and another business unit could be the size of a feature. And so like 2 acquisitions, you're getting really different cultures coming from 2 different companies versus a feature that's been at Twilio forever. You may have a bit more of a similar culture. And so ensuring that we had a security person to help them through kind of larger discussions, risk discussions, and to really group together. It isn't just application or product security that they care about, but there are other issues such as cloud security, enterprise security, third-party security that the BISO would bring all together.
Okay. And you mentioned like each team had different culture, and depending on the company, like between segment and field, it was also a different culture, and like actually transforming a company's culture is super hard, super challenging. What kind of motivated you to trying to constantly contribute to that? Because sometimes you just want to, okay, I can't do it anymore, and you just want to abandon.
Yeah. I think when you experience a really great security culture, it's hard to go back to not having that. It's hard to see a project and not say, oh, this could be a lot more successful if engineers cared and engaged with us. We could go a lot further. We could have a lot more impact. So I feel like once you experience it, you can't go back. And so when I experienced really great security cultures at different companies, and I came to Twilio and I saw a different type of security culture, I think good can be very subjective, but a different type than what I was used to, right? Where security kind of existed outside of engineering. They weren't working too closely together. And security was security's problem. It wasn't an engineering's problem. There was no shared responsibility. And so that also meant folks would push back on a lot of the security initiatives. And so it was really difficult to see how can you be successful in a security role without doing some of this cultural transformation. So there were many, many challenges, not just with engineering teams, but also creating this culture shift amongst the different security teams. As I was coming from an acquisition group, there was a lot of in versus out group dynamics that made it really difficult to convince folks, hey, let's all kind of create this culture shift. There are a lot of teams that had kind of this opinion that this isn't broken. Like, why are you changing this? Like, this currently works. I've been at Twilio a lot longer than you. I'm a lot more experienced than you. Let's keep it this way. And to really push for that change was very difficult. But because I had a lot of leadership buy-in and a lot of allies, were able to get the buy-in necessary so that security was on the same page, and then to work towards influencing all of engineering.
Yeah, I think it's always hard when you just come to a new company and want to implement new changes, because people, especially inside, they don't see actually. Like sometimes when you work for years or in the same company, you just don't see as much as you can see like with a fresh eye. And it just takes some time, and it takes indeed a good management and good leadership to actually get buying on the initiative. And it's hard when it's a really large company. Like in a small company, it's kind of easy because the relationships are very different. But how do, for example, you mentioned like there are several teams, and with a different culture. Are there any rituals maybe that you implemented for them to kind of try to be more aligned?
We didn't have any specific rituals, not at the top of my head, but the BSO program was really, really helpful because they had an avenue to talk with someone about security who had kind of that leadership role. I think that's really important to have that leadership representative. And then we had different programs that they can reach out with us through. And so we were trying a lot of things. And so we had at one point tried a partnership model. That didn't work out so well because we didn't have a lot of metrics to pull from this. And we kind of went in and we said, hey, we're going to partner with this team because they're a critical function within Twilio. They make the most amount of revenue. It makes sense for us to partner with them. But we didn't do enough setup. We didn't make it really clear, what are we going to deliver at the end of this partnership? Because we're still figuring that out ourselves. And then once we did start to learn more, we're like, okay, let's work on this. We couldn't get commitment from the team to really make progress. There were always blockers of like, hey, this person's out of office. Hey, we're going to deprioritize this for another item. And so we didn't take the necessary steps or like identify this ritual that would have set us up for success. So ultimately we saw, hey, we weren't able to create this risk reduction that we set out to do. But the team gave us such great feedback. They're like, oh my goodness, this team was amazing. They came in and they really improved security. And we were getting a lot of this like security kudos, security recognition when all we did was sit in a lot of meetings. We would sit in a lot of meetings. Maybe we chime in here and there. We weren't really reducing risk. We didn't have the ritual to set up the metrics. We made people feel good because we were giving them attention. But beyond that, I couldn't point to a single thing that kind of strategically reduced risk for this business unit. Versus with the BSO model, we did see that because there were strategic objectives that they're working through, and it's a longer term partnership versus a short term where there can be wins that happen really quickly. There can be wins that happen over time, but they're building out that relationship, and their kind of progress or their success isn't dictated by the end of the quarter, because a lot of those wins are happening kind of throughout multi-quarters, or they're interspersed. Maybe there's one win in Q1, maybe there's nothing huge in Q2 because the team is focused on something outside of security. And so I thought that model worked really really well and had a bit more structure, and they set themselves up for success.
And how did you tie, their strategic objectives, which I think are business objectives, to this back to the security?
So they were tied one and together. So we started to adopt an OKR model, I want to say like my second year at Twilio. And so they started to tie, hey, we're going to remediate critical and high vulnerabilities. We're going to remediate all of our critical and high vulnerabilities within SLA. And so we were able to anchor ourselves based off the OKR. And so that is the BSOs, the CISO, and our CDO, which is like owns more than the CISO, like I think IT as well at the time. They're all working together to negotiate that security needs to be a business objective, right? They all work together where the BSOs are working maybe on kind of more specific in-depth issues. And then as you went up to the CISO and the CDO, they're working on broader strokes of how do we ensure that we have some focus or a theme that we focus on. And so one of those themes were vulnerability management. And then we continue to have other themes that we focused on.
Okay. And what is the themes that are the most interesting for you personally? Because I saw like you mentioned on one of the podcasts, that you've been to, that you started as a penetration tester. Like how did it happen actually? And how did you end up where you are now?
Completely by accident. I have a computer science background. And so I was looking for any type of technical job, but I didn't want to become a software engineer. Didn't find a lot of joy with coding. And so found this job, had no idea it was pen testing. I think one of my teammates at the time like told me like, oh yeah, we're going on like a social engineering assessment. And I put in quotes, oh, you're social engineering someone. Cause that's like something you see in movies. It's not something someone like says out loud. And so it gave me a lot of exposure to security. I think with a pen testing job, you get a lot of breadth. So I did a couple of network assessments. I did a mobile pen test, a web pen test, one social engineering engagement. And so you get experience to a lot of the different like flavors of security. And then ultimately I found that I didn't like being this like outside firm providing recommendation to a company once a year. There was a lot of annuity work where we'd get the same contracts every year. And I found that we'd find the same exact vulnerabilities. And so we'd sometimes offer like a developer call. So we'd kind of work with a developer to talk through the report findings and what they could do. And this is different than just kind of the report readout with the execs. And the developer was always just so defeated because we're coming to like basically like tell on them once a year, telling them like, hey, you're not doing a great job. You have this, then this type of vulnerability. And at times it appeared like I had no empathy for them, that they have a lot of things fighting for their attention. They don't have all the tools and the resources. And for some companies, this is the one time a year that they get to talk to a security person and they'll ask really like thoughtful questions because they didn't have that training necessary. Security is really under-resourced. And so that really motivated me to switch over to application security engineer. I found that I really liked doing web app pen tests and some mobile pen tests. And I was able to do that in-house and figure out, okay, I take a pen test report. How do I actually make change so that those findings don't show up the next year, or kind of a different flavor of that doesn't show up the next year? And that's a problem that we like still tackled with, which is like our bug bounty reports, where we consistently get the same exact finding. Like subdomain takeovers is a really popular one where like the researcher will report 5, you're like, I'm going to reward 1 because it's the same exact thing. Or maybe you do report all 5. And then you find a 6th and a 7th and you keep paying out for the 6th and the 7th. And it's how do we put an end to this? Because we can't just keep paying out for this because we patch it in one location here, patch it in another location here. We need to eliminate this vulnerability because we know that this is a persistent issue. But for things like subdomain takeovers, they're kind of rated a bit lower. They're not putting this like massive engineering effort. And so that's something that I really care about, is how do we eliminate vulnerabilities at a company? We're getting a lot of these signals. We pay for a lot of these services that tell us, hey, broken access control is a really big problem at your company. It's number 1 on OS top 10. And we just take the finding, we fix it, and then we get another finding and we fix it, and we set up more tooling to tell us, hey, your broken access control sucks. As a application security team, how do we become a lot more proactive about it and make sure that broken access control isn't something that we're introducing to new features and is something that we're working on remediating for all of our existing features?
And do you think threat modeling, for example, is the way to go, or in development, or how early do you think we should involve security, at
So
the development of a new feature?
I don't think it's a question of how early. The issue with threat modeling is that it can be really complex and it may not include the entire picture, right? So when you're threat modeling one design, that's one design, and there can be many other designs, or that design can change, or the person performing the threat modeling didn't identify all of the threats because the system's too complex. When you have only an hour or maybe 2 meetings where you're reviewing all of these threat modeling documents before you actually perform the threat model, you may not have all of the information necessary to prevent 100% of vulnerabilities. And that's why a security program isn't just threat modeling. It's comprised of many other teams to kind of help you. What I think really is the right path is having secure by default solutions. So if you have kind of broken access control, providing a library or framework on like a popular platform or system where it's no longer possible because you have a lot better like auth controls. I think there's many different ways beyond just adding additional cognitive load to engineers. And by having a paved path, a secure by default solution, this makes it so that engineers aren't having to grapple with, here's the 100 security things I need to think about, and like I have to apply it correctly, and I have to make sure I didn't miss the 101st checklist that is floating around somewhere in our team wiki. And so I think threat modeling is a very useful tool, but it's not the end all be all. And that we have to really shift our thinking. It's not how early in the design, but how do you reduce the cognitive load for engineers so that they're not making a mistake on accident, or they're not following a process that is very mistake prone.
And how do you make sure that you, for example, keep track, all the secure libraries, because some engineers, sometimes they might want also to use their libraries that they've heard about or read, a newsletter, or heard, I don't know, from someone in the meetup. And it can be a bit tricky sometimes because you need to test, I guess, and retest. And how do you make sure you keep that list precise, and do you retest then everything, or if there is a new, for example, a release?
So this is something I'm currently exploring in my current role. And so it isn't something we have delivered on yet, but the goal is to kind of go with widely adopted platforms and to provide security baselines through there. But one thing that I've seen through other podcasts is like Netflix's talks about context, not control. If you make the easiest, fastest way to deploy also the secure way, folks want to adopt to that. There may be many reasons why they chose not to go down that path, but that's kind of our job to really engage with engineers. One thing I've been struggling with quite a bit is how do we measure engineering engagement? A lot of the qualitative tools that we have out there are really limited. You can use things like a net promoter score. You can use kind of like a cultural survey, but it's really, really difficult to understand if we're headed towards the right path in terms of engaging with engineers. You can obviously measure like adoption, but that doesn't really say like, did an engineer enjoy doing that? One other thing that I've started to look at is like engineering disruption time, where how often are we like disrupting an engineer to do more security activities? And if you were to do like 100% engineering disruption time, you just get rid of security. So there's like a balance of like, maybe it's more security toil where if I'm asking you currently to do 10 hours of security work, how can I reduce that to 1 hour where it's consistent, automated? And so you're not going to have like 5 hours of investigating and like 2 hours of testing it. These are all really still in like beginning design stages. And so I'm hoping we'll have more to share in the coming like year or so of how we're able to build a solution that reduces the cognitive load for engineers. When we shift really far left, there's a lot of cognitive load because their design is unstable still, right? They're thinking through many different elements. Security is one of them. And then they're chatting with a bunch of other teams to make sure that they're headed towards the right path. So how do we reduce some of the cognitive load that happens, the disruption that we introduce to them so that it is a very kind of straightforward path?
Have you ever had like a pushback from the product teams? Because usually they're the ones who are dealing, let's say they have a product, new feature. They're the ones working with the engineers and they're the ones responsible for the delivery. versus business objectives. So it's kind of also trade-off between business objectives. Like, have you ever had a pushback from product team?
So we haven't built out this yet, but in terms of threat modeling, 100%. If there was a recommendation and they're like, yeah, no, we need to ship this next week, like this is not happening. And that's happened. And so one of the things we've done to adapt to that with our threat models is we allow engineers to prioritize their remediations. And we're trying to threat model not too early, but where the design is stable. And that really differs for a lot of teams where they have some time to make the changes, but their design is somewhat kind of written in sand, right? It's at least written down. It can be modified. It's not written in stone, because that's when you really struggle to influence the team, because they say, we can't, no, we've already put too much work into this. Like we're not failing
Not
this.
flexible.
And to be the team that says like, nope, you have to, you want that to be very rare, and you want it to be because of like extraordinary business impacts. You don't want that to be kind of run-of-the-mill conversations that you're having with engineers who are like, nope, that work is a waste, wrap it up, we're going to redo it. Like you never want to be the person to say any of that. And so with our threat modeling templates, it's making sure that they're really engineering driven. An engineer is the one identifying a lot of those risks present within their designs, and they're the ones proposing the changes, and they're the ones prioritizing what changes need to be get done first. And we help them have this discussion, but engineers know a lot more about their designs than a security engineer who spent 1 hour or 2 hours reviewing those designs.
And if it's the engineers who kind of prioritize the risks and define the risks, do you think engineers all actually realize sometimes all business-related risks?
No, and that's where I think we need to do a better job surfacing that. And so that was a big thing that we did at Twilio, was getting a lot more visibility into our threats at the company and understanding our like business risk register. And so that was something we're working towards, where instead of just having like a security risk register, we wanted to combine all of the risks present at the business. And so when we have conversations with engineering, we're not just talking about, here are your top 10 security risks, here are your top 10 compliance risks, here are your top 10 reliability risks, but here are your top 10 risks. And we've all gone into a room and we've discussed that like security is number 4 and 5, but maybe reliability is number 1 on this list, so that we're not like competing with each other for attention and time. But that's really hard to surface that information in a threat model. And that's generally why people like having a security engineer in that room. It's so that they can represent the company's interests and you're focused on your design. And so that I think has been somewhat difficult, of how do you ensure that folks are understanding that priority? We were just using like impact and probability, but that is also sometimes really subjective. Like what types of impact?
It is subjective.
And if you try to add a bit more structure by like using like a template or matrix, then you add more cognitive load, because you're like, for that specificity, you have to now add this like complicated looking matrix to then like get a score and then put that in. And so it's all a bit of a balance of how do you motivate action without trying, like, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. It's always a balancing act, and knowing that a threat model doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like your program is not threat modeling. There are other controls that you can really rely on, and figuring out kind of how you want to weight the importance of threat modeling compared to the other programs that you have. I think that's really important, and you want that to be specific to the business and the types of engineers you're working with.
And I think it's super hard to identify and actually get everyone aligned on the same, make everyone, to be aligned, to be on the same page and understand like this is important. Do you like there are some tools that are working on that, to help security engineers actually kind of prioritize also business related risks? To what extent do you think that tool like that will work actually and fully understand, the logic behind the application?
So I think instead of a tool, like I'm a really big proponent of your company top 10 instead of relying on like OWASP top 10, but to pull all of the data from all of your sources, whether that's your bug bounty, your pen test, your tooling, your risk register, pulling all of that together. And oftentimes this can be really difficult because the reporting format may not be the same, right? They may use different categories, they may use different ratings to really kind of assimilate all of that data. Very difficult to do. But once you're able to do that and get an idea of your kind of top 10 risks or your top 10 vulnerabilities, you can start to have a lot of these discussions to say, okay, I have data to prove that this is our number one issue. Let's really put our resources at it from throughout the entire SDLC. And so that means during the design stage, hey, I'm going to really make sure that we get this right with the tooling that we provide, like our secure by default solutions. We're going to make sure that this is really easy to prevent with our detections. We're going to make it so it's really easy for us to detect this before it becomes an incident. So I do think having an understanding of not just like your threat landscape, but all of the different sources that exist within a team is really important. But this is also really hard to like motivate as a team project because you're trying to like work with multiple teams, collaborate quite a lot, and get folks to like when you try. One thing that we really, really struggled with is if you can find one categorization for all vulnerabilities, risks, and threats, or even a definition, like that's so difficult to do at a company. We really struggled with that where we could not find a categorization for, there's like 5 or 6 teams where we just needed one categorization in our vuln management program. And we gave up and we're like, you know what, we're going to have 3 because we can't agree to one language. We're going to have 3. We can map them back to each other, but like, that's not a big issue. And that was something where it's really, really hard to categorize everything and to really get a company top 10 because there are nuances to each categorization system or missing categories or too many categories. So it's really hard to pick your category. So that was something I've really struggled with, that there isn't this medium cognitive load, enough like depth and enough flexibility in any categories. You never want like a blank field where like people can write whatever.
After how long do you think you should give up? Like, let's say someone wants to implement that at their company, like when enough is enough?
In terms of categories or like broadly?
Broadly, like they want to try because, for example, I've talked, I think, a month ago with another security engineer, and he told me that it took them 1.5 years to develop their kind of internal ASPM solution to aggregate all the data from all the tools. I mean, they're a big company, so they can allow themselves to work on it, but like 1.5 years for the whole like security team, that's a lot of time to be spent like on the topic, but maybe in your perception that's not enough. I don't know. So when do you think it's like you have to really continue working on really refining everything, finding perfect scoring, or when you have to say, okay, let's define 3 categories and go with it?
So I think if it's like an internal and external product, there are definitely different pressures. So it's really dependent. But if it's an internal tool, who does the like having 3 categories affect? It doesn't really affect anyone because we can map them all back together. And so to me, I like to take the path of least resistance where this is a really low impact to have just one categorization. We can have 3. There aren't any issues with that would really like prevent work or lead to kind of any loss of data. And so for us, it made sense to have those 3 categories. But if you're kind of like an external facing product and you're selling it to customers, I'd imagine folks would want one category or the option to have their specific category or a right category. I think you'll never get a categorization correct. Like everyone will always have an opinion on it. There'll always be like a new categorization mechanism and people are like, oh, let's go back to so you're never going to win. Good luck to the people doing like a customer facing categorization.
I think winning it's always going to be hard, and especially it depends then, as again, if we're coming back, on the topic of the culture, it depends on the culture and how it's defined and who has the last word, I guess, as well. If it's, very flat structures that there are like more like a pyramid or sort of the high hierarchy, that in the end, it's sometimes easier as well to make decisions on certain topics, and do you think like culturally wise, we'll see some changes in the upcoming years that more and more organizations will actually focus on security and put security first?
I think it depends. It really depends on the type of company, the resources that they have, and some of the external pressures that they face. It really depends. I feel like I live in a bit of a tech bubble. And so for me, it's like we've always put a lot of resources at security. And I don't have a lot of visibility into a lot of the other kind of sectors that exist, right? Like I have never worked for like a financial organization. So I know security is very important to them because they have a lot of like regulations and compliance. But for a lot of companies, like I know with cybersecurity insurance, it can also make you think like, hey, like I'm just going to fund this security team to like, it's just like a budgetary number, right? Like how do I put the minimum number before like, if I get an incident has any like financial ramifications towards my company. So that means like, okay, cyber insurance and like fund this team to like bare bones. And then that's about it, right? Like, that team cares about security and that like they've funded a security team, but that's about it. Versus there are teams that have funded a security a lot. They're like, we're going to get the best tools. We're going to get the best team. And yet they still have an incident. And so, there's a really great article by Kelly Shortridge on like YOLOSEC versus FOMOSEC that I often think about because that's exactly how it feels where YOLOSEC is like, you get the nicest things. You're like, YOLO, I get everything. And then FOMOSEC is like, FOMOSEC is you have the fear of missing out. So you like get everything. YOLOSEC, you like don't do very much, but you want to find somewhere to be on that line, but it's understanding like what motivates a security team. It really is a mix of stuff, right? Like there are customer requests that we get, customer branding, there are financial implications. There's also just like building a better product. And so finding a company that you feel like has a very broad security philosophy that matters to you, that it is a company that cares about security, makes your job as a security engineer a lot better. Because if you're at a company that are like, we do not care about security, you're always fighting against something bigger than yourself. And I think it definitely is a very like admirable task to go to a company that is really antagonistic against security and want to make an impact. But at a certain point, it may just be bigger than you and that you can have a lot more impact at a lot more security conscious company in figuring out how do you make security the best possible experience, reduce that cognitive load, minimize the engineering disruption time, minimize the number of incidents with a well-resourced team. I, for one, have struggled with like, how do I be part of a company that doesn't have the same values that I do? But others like have no problem. They're like, nope, it's the job. Like you get the work done. But that definitely is just like not my type of like personality or the types of jobs I enjoy working at.
And do you think if someone, let's say, new in the security, if they start and they're really passionate about it and they want to make an impact and they actually want to change company culture, and what would be your advice, like of the key steps to get started? The action steps that they can try to do. I mean, obviously after certain time, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. You can't constantly knock on a closed door. But if they still want to try, like what would you advise them to do to get started?
I think start small, right? It's find your strong allies, find your champions in the sense of like the people who are really going to help champion your program and say like, hey, I really promote this, like really just an ally in a lot of aspects. Because I think if you go in with this like big goal of like, I'm going to create culture change, you may be a little bit disappointed for a really long time, get really upset. But if you have a program process or tool that you're interested in and that you can get others involved and get them caring about security, you create a small culture shift, right? Let's say training for once. Instead of doing like a recorded training, you're able to find like a balance of like on demand and live trainings that are really engaging, high quality. That's just one small section. And you are able to give this training to all new engineers. And every new engineer that comes in was like, wow, that was a really amazing training. And then they go to their new teams and they start asking security questions. They're like, oh, what are we doing about logging that was mentioned during my training? Oh, what are we doing? Are we using these libraries or using these frameworks or are we on this paved path? And they're asking all those questions it gets the other engineers starting to think more about security, and they're like, oh, what was this training that you're in? And I think you've now created, in those like small instances, a culture shift there. And then you can continue to expand that of, okay, now these engineers are more interested and they're a bit more vocal in what they want out of security. And then you're able to say, okay, yeah, this is great. We can use kind of this appeal and then use that to fund other projects and to get other buy-in. But start small. I don't think you should tackle the entire company at once. Start with a program and then make sure you have the necessary leadership buy-in for that program. And then make sure you're engaging with engineers and that you're adapting to the needs of the company at the time. And then you'll slowly start to see that culture shift through a variety of programs. Because like culture change itself isn't a program that you do, but it's something that comes about a really engaging program.
And there is one also question that I always ask at the end of the podcast. What book would you recommend? For a security one or not, as you wish.
I think this is a really great book because it talks a lot about culture, and it is really easy to read. I read it in one sitting because it was just super fast to read, and I love great books like that because if you give me a really big book, I'm going to take a month to read it. So it's The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. It reads like a novel because he kind of sets it with like a team of 5 executives that is dysfunctional. And oftentimes you see dysfunctions in an organization. And I love that he gives a name to a lot of these dysfunctions and talks through how you remediate those dysfunctions. And it's something I'm really cognizant about of these are the things I kind of value in a team. And these are the kind of methods and tools I can do to really get that team culture. And it can be present within your team. It can be present within your org. It can be present within a company. Quite an interesting read. And I really enjoyed reading it.
Do you think soft skills for security is something actually more important than a hard skill?
Depends on the role. I think if you just
for application security, for example.
Depends on the role of your team, right? And the makeup of the team. Like if you just had an application security team that only did soft skills, I think you'd struggle because you can't like build anything. Not saying people with soft skills can't build, but I'm assuming like you're like, okay, this person has primarily soft skills and maybe less so on some of those like harder technical skills. You need a good balance of both. So it is important and to have people who have great soft skills, but I think to have a lot of those technical skills that can build, that's another way of building empathy with engineers. So it really is a balance.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ariel, for coming on the podcast and for sharing your experience with the listeners. It was super interesting, and I hope that after we get the comments at the video that I got inspired and I'm gonna start small and get my engineers on board. And try to get like them be more interested in the security and then grow maybe larger and like actually this cultural shift.
Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed being on this podcast.